Today's submitted material is a highly energized political commentary transcript breaking down a massive, hypothetical U.S. military campaign in Iran and its subsequent domestic fallout. I mean, let's just get right to the feedback.
Yeah, grouping thematic elements into distinct signposted chapters creates a much stronger narrative impact than jumping rapidly between global warfare and domestic social media spats. Because right now, this transcript suffers from just incredibly disorienting structural whiplash.
Oh, totally.
It rapidly oscillates between these massive, earth-shattering geopolitical events and then, hyper-specific, localized domestic grievances without giving the reader any time to adjust.
Yeah, I actually want to look at the exact moment this happens in the text because it perfectly illustrates the problem. The author is deeply immersed in discussing the macroeconomic impacts of oil flowing through the Strait of Hormuz.
Right.
Which is obviously a massive global choke point with trillion-dollar implications. But then, without a single transitional sentence, the text jumps straight into Gavin Newsom's local tax policies in California.
Yeah, it's crazy.
And then suddenly pivots again to a specific isolated crime committed in North Carolina.
It completely breaks the immersion. I mean, when you are reading political commentary, or any narrative really, your brain establishes a certain baseline for the stakes.
Exactly.
If we are talking about the destruction of the Iranian Navy and the strategic implications for China's oil supply, the reader's mind is operating on a macro, global scale.
Yeah, you're in the war room.
Plunging them instantly into a localized protest in New York or bringing up Tucker Carlson's television commentary forces the reader to violently shift gears.
Reading this feels exactly like watching a movie, where the projectionist is constantly toggling the channel between a sprawling high-stakes global war epic and like a highly localized reality TV show.
That's a great way to put it.
You never let the audience actually settle into the stakes of either narrative. You're asking the reader to care about a global nuclear threat and a local mayoral controversy in the exact same breath.
Which psychologically just doesn't work.
No, it doesn't. The human brain naturally trivializes the smaller issue when placed immediately next to a massive one, which undercuts the author's own domestic arguments.
So how do we fix this without losing the breadth of the commentary? Because the author clearly wants to cover both the international military victories and the domestic cultural reaction.
Right, they want the whole picture.
To make this work, they need to reorganize the content into broad, distinct thematic blocks using clear verbal signposts to guide the audience from the macro scale down to the micro scale.
So you have to tell the reader that we are changing gears.
Exactly. Let's map out exactly what that looks like. You dedicate the entire first block of the transcript exclusively to the global theater.
You just group all of those macro events together.
Right. Keep them isolated, but the military strikes in Iran, the deployment of the B-2 bomber, the reopening of the Strait of Hormuz, and the strategic squeezing of adversaries like China and Russia all in one uninterrupted section.
Yeah. You let the audience live entirely in that geopolitical space. You let them feel the awe of that hypothetical global strategy without any interruption.
And once that geopolitical thought is totally complete, you have to build a bridge.
A transitional hook.
Yeah, you need a hook that explicitly tells the reader, hey, we are now moving from the global to the domestic. You could write something like, while the global map is being redrawn, the domestic front is having its own meltdown.
That one sentence does so much heavy lift. It acknowledges the macro events we just discussed, and it sets the stage for the micro events we're about to explore.
Exactly. And once you cross that bridge, you pivot entirely into the domestic theater. You group together the commentary on the SAVE Act, the New York City mayoral controversies, the media's reaction to the war, and the local border issue.
By compartmentalizing the emotional journey, you solve the structural whiplash.
Yeah, the reader gets to fully digest the geopolitical wins and process that high-level strategic maneuvering first.
Then, they get to shift their emotional energy and get fired up about the domestic injustices.
The two theaters are no longer constantly interrupting and undermining each other.
Moving on to the second point, relying too heavily on repetitive, extreme insults diminishes the rhetorical punch of the commentary and ultimately distracts from the underlying geopolitical analysis.
Oh, absolutely. This text leans so frequently on derogatory labels, using terms like retards, cucks, and other extreme profanities continuously.
Yeah, they're everywhere.
To the point that these words quickly lose their shock value and just become mere verbal filler. This is a really interesting dynamic to unpack. The material clearly aims for a highly aggressive, unapologetic brand. That's obviously the voice they want.
Right?
But when the speaker tries to make a genuinely interesting strategic point, the analytical weight of that point is completely undercut by the repetitive profanity surrounding it.
It just gets buried.
So if the overarching goal of this piece is to present the current administration as a geopolitical mastermind playing 4D chess, does this highly informal, almost chaotic insult comedy tone actually support that framing?
That's the real question. Or does it accidentally make the analysis sound less credible to the very audience it's trying to hype up?
I do think we have to be careful here, though. If we completely sanitize the text and strip away all the insults, aren't we just homogenizing the author's voice?
Sure, you don't want to lose the edge.
The audience tuning into this kind of commentary specifically wants that edgy, unfiltered, unapologetic aggression. If we make it sound like a sterile academic paper, we lose the core appeal of the brand.
Oh, I completely agree. And the goal isn't to remove the aggression. The goal is to make the aggression actually effective.
Right.
Think of it like hot sauce. When you cover an entire dish in hot sauce, you can't taste the ingredients anymore. Your mouth is just numb.
That's a perfect analogy.
Extreme language needs to be treated as a targeted spice rather than the main ingredient. The author needs to deliberately elevate their vocabulary during the analytical sections to create a sharper, more effective contrast.
The psychology of contrast in writing is fascinating because if you yell all the time, yelling becomes your baseline whisper. The reader's brain just tunes it out.
Yeah, it just becomes white noise.
But if you maintain a cold, calculated insider tone and then drop a single highly aggressive punchline, that contrast shocks the reader into paying attention.
It makes the humor land so much harder.
Exactly. And it makes the intelligence of the geopolitical analysis shine through. Right now, the transcript presents a really compelling theory that squeezing Iran and Venezuela chokes off China's oil supply and flips the global chessboard.
Which is a great point.
But that incredible insight gets totally lost in the noise of the surrounding insults.
So let's look at how the author can implement this contrast practically. When breaking down that China-Venezuela-Iran oil triangle, the author should adopt a momentarily cold, calculated tone.
Right.
Use authoritative, clinical terms like strategic strangulation or geopolitical dominoes. You spend a few sentences sounding like a high-level military strategist briefing a war room.
You establish that high-level authoritative baseline first, and it's only after establishing that undeniable authority that you drop your punchline.
Yeah.
Instead of defaulting to calling the media a derogatory name for the 5th time in a single page, the author could say the media is so busy clutching their pearls over international law that they completely miss the geopolitical checkmate.
That is exactly the kind of contrast we're talking about. It maintains the edgy, aggressive brand that the audience loves, but it makes the speaker sound remarkably intelligent and in control.
You aren't just a guy ranting on the internet.
Right. You're an incredibly sharp geopolitical analyst who also happens to have a razor-sharp biting wit.
It creates a highly engaging rhythm for the listener. Analytical setup, aggressive punchline. Analytical setup, aggressive punchline.
That rhythm keeps the reader hooked because they are constantly being fed high-level insights rewarded with a sharp, cathartic joke.
Which leads us to the final critique. Grounding grand assertions in brief, factual mechanic transforms the speaker from a mere reactor to events into an authoritative insider.
Yes, the mechanics are so important.
The final sections of this transcript frequently make massive, sweeping claims, asserting that the U.S. single-handedly neutralized a nuclear threat or completely rewrote global alliances overnight.
Right.
But the author relies almost entirely on emotional bravado and quoting press conferences rather than explaining the actual mechanics of how this is happening.
Well, we do get a lot of really fun, highly stylized analogies in this piece. The author describes a military using level 76 Charizard tactics against enemies who are stuck using level 12 Bulbasaur moves.
Which is pretty funny.
It's a great pop culture reference, and it fits the energetic tone perfectly. But the lack of grounding details leaves the analysis feeling incredibly superficial.
It is unearned bravado.
Yeah, the audience is mostly just taking the speaker's word for it that these global victories are happening magically.
Exactly. If you don't give the reader the tools to understand the victory, they can't fully appreciate it.
Right.
It's the difference between telling someone a chess grandmaster won a game versus showing them the 3 specific pawn movements that trap the opponent's queen. The latter makes the reader feel smart.
Yeah, look at the claim about the Strait of Hormuz in the text.
Okay.
The material asserts that the strait was reopened purely because of one single tweet from the president.
But wait, doesn't that fit the narrative of the all-powerful executive?
I mean, arguably.
If the goal is to make the president look like a commanding force of nature, attributing a massive geopolitical shift to a single tweet does exactly that. Why bog down that momentum with technical details about shipping lanes?
Because it strains credibility even for a sympathetic audience, and it misses a massive opportunity for the author to sound like a true foreign policy insider.
That makes sense.
By omitting the actual mechanical leverage, like specific naval deployments moving into the region, targeted economic threats, or the massive spikes in shipping risk insurance policies that the author only briefly mentioned in passing.
Right. They barely touched on that.
The text just fails to explain the machinery underneath the rhetoric. The audience knows a tweet didn't literally clear a waterway. They want to know what the tweet triggered.
So the author needs to integrate brief, punchy explanations of the actual leverage behind these global events, backing up the bravado with perceived tactical depth.
Exactly. It's about building trust with the reader. When you drop a specific, highly technical detail into a passionate rant, you prove to the audience that you actually understand the underlying reality of the situation.
You aren't just cheering for the explosions on the screen. You know exactly why the fuse was lit.
So how do we weave these mechanics into the text without slowing down that fast-paced, aggressive momentum the author wants to maintain?
Honestly, it really only takes one or two sentences. Let's look at the Venezuela.
Okay.
Instead of just declaring, "We captured Maduro and now Venezuela is ours," which frankly sounds like a cartoon summary.
Yeah, a bit too simplistic.
You briefly explain the mechanism to the audience. You could write, by physically removing the leadership and aggressively cutting off the oil revenue lifeline, the regime folded overnight, giving the U.S. control of 100 million barrels and flipping the entire South American chess.
I mean, that takes maybe 10 extra seconds to read, but it adds an immense amount of credibility.
Right.
You've explained the how. Physical removal plus revenue strangulation equals regime collapse. It elevates the text from a fan reaction piece to actual geopolitical commentary.
And we see the exact same opportunity with the B-2 bomber section.
Oh yeah, definitely.
The text mentions dropping 2,000-pound bombs on Iranian nuclear facilities. To ground this, the author just needs to briefly mention the specific logistical dominance required to bypass deep granite bunkers.
Right.
You mentioned the specialized ordnance or the radar-evading flight paths. Again, there are many ways to weave these facts in, but the goal is to reinforce that blue-eyed white dragon gaming analogy with tangible, awe-inspiring military reality.
You give the reader a glimpse behind the curtain of global power. It's the Tom Clancy effect.
Exactly.
You give the reader just enough technical, insider terminology to make them feel like they are sitting in the situation room.
Right, and when you combine that level of mechanical, factual grounding with the newly organized macro to micro structure, and you punctuate it with that targeted, highly contrasting aggressive tone, the entire piece transforms.
It stops being a chaotic, exhausting stream of consciousness, and it becomes a genuinely gripping, highly persuasive piece of political commentary.
So let's quickly summarize the core takeaways from today's critique.
Yeah, let's wrap it up.
First, to solve the structural whiplash, the author needs to group the material into distinct thematic chapters, separate the global geopolitical theater completely from the domestic culture wars, and use clear verbal signposts to transition between the two.
Second, the author needs to calibrate the tone to maximize its impact by using extreme, aggressive language as a deliberate punctuation mark rather than constant, numbing filler. The strategic analysis will hit much harder, and the humor will actually land.
And finally, to elevate the speaker's authority, the grand claims of victory must be anchored with brief, punchy explanations of the actual tactical leverage being used. Explain the mechanics of the win. Don't just celebrate the result.
We highly encourage the listener to implement these structural, tonal, and mechanical shifts, revise the material, and submit it back in for another critique. Because when you organize your thoughts, control your contrast, and prove your expertise, you stop asking the audience to just blindly follow along, and you start actively leading them through your worldview.